My name is Harold Walker. I am 70 years old, and I thought the new year would bring a fresh start, not a knife to the heart. I gave up the house where my late wife and I built our life. I poured every dollar into the mansion my son and his wife now call theirs, believing I would always have a place. But on New Year's Day, while the guests raised their glasses, my daughter-in-law leaned close and smiled, telling me the best gift was if I disappeared forever. What would you do if the family you sacrificed everything for wanted you gone? Stay with me, because what happened next turned their celebration into ashes. New Year's morning had always felt different to me, a little quieter, a little heavier, as if the world itself paused to think about what had been lost and what might come. That morning in January of 2023, I sat by the wide window in the San Diego mansion, the one everyone insisted on calling David and Elena's house. The winter sun poured through the glass, warming my hands as I held a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The house smelled of polished wood and freshly cut flowers, all part of the grand party Elena had been planning for weeks. 200 guests, she said with pride. A celebration to show the world what kind of family we were. I traced the rim of the mug and let my mind wander back. It had been 8 years since I left Cleveland, since I sold the old red brick house where Harold and I raised David. That house had been my pride, and when Harold died in 2010, I kept every corner spotless, every memory preserved. In 2015, I signed it away, $750,000 gone into the down payment for this mansion. Elena had walked me through the empty rooms. Back then, her hand brushing the white marble countertops, her voice bright with promises. "You will always have a place here, Dad." That sentence had carried me across the country. Now, sitting in the sunlit living room, I watched Elena rush past me in her silk blouse, a glass of champagne already in her hand. Though it was barely 10 in the morning, she directed the staff with the sharpness of a drill sergeant. The florist had arrived late. The musicians needed to set up. The caterers were unloading boxes in the kitchen. She had thought of everything. Everyone, that is, except me. David came down the grand staircase, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked tired, older than his 42 years. Our eyes met for a second, and I searched for something familiar. Some trace of the boy who used to follow me around the yard, begging to hold the hammer while I fixed the fence. But his gaze slid past me as if I were a guest already overstaying my welcome. I stood, stretched my stiff back, and moved toward the patio. Outside, the palm trees swayed gently. The sound of laughter drifted from the driveway as early arrivals greeted each other. Elena followed me out, her heels clicking on the tile. She stopped close, so close I could smell the expensive perfume she always wore, the kind that lingered long after she left the room. Her smile was wide, practiced, the smile of a woman who wanted the world to see her as generous, sophisticated, untouchable. She lifted her glass, leaned in just enough that only I could hear, and let the words fall like shards of glass. "The best gift this new year is if you disappear from our family." For a moment I thought I had misheard her, that maybe the hum of voices around us or the clink of glasses had twisted her meaning. But then I saw the cold certainty in her eyes, the way her lips curled slightly, as if savoring the cruelty. I turned my head, searching for David. He stood a few feet away, talking with a neighbor. His shoulders stiffened, his ears had caught enough, but he did not turn around. He kept speaking, nodding politely, pretending he hadn't heard a thing. Something inside me sank heavier than stone. The house seemed to close in the laughter from the driveway, suddenly shrill. Elena's smile never wavered, and when she walked back inside, her heels echoed like the ticking of a clock. I stayed outside, letting the cool air steady me. I looked at the ring on my finger, the plain silver band Harold had given me on our 10th anniversary. She had been gone 13 years, but her voice was still with me. "Do not ever let anyone strip you of your dignity, Robert. Do not ever let them think your place in this family can be erased." I whispered the words aloud, quiet enough that only I could hear. right then. You want me to disappear? You will have your gift." I stayed there until the sun moved higher, until the noise from the kitchen rose into a dull roar. Guests began arriving in shiny cars, laughter spilling through the gate. To them, this was a house full of joy and wealth and celebration. To me, it was a cage. I slipped back inside, moving through the crowd, unseen, a ghost already fading. David avoided my eyes. Elena glowed as she welcomed her friends. I carried the weight of their dismissal in my chest, but under it, deeper still, something else began to form, slow and deliberate. A plan sharp as glass, patient as time. I set down my empty coffee cup on the polished marble counter, the same counter I had paid for 8 years ago, and walked toward the quiet of my room. It was New Year's Day, and my son's wife had just given me the cruelest gift of all. I was ready to return it. The hallway was buzzing with footsteps and laughter as guests settled in, but all I could hear was the sound of my own pulse. I stopped halfway to my room and turned toward the den where David was speaking with 2 men from his office. He was nodding, smiling politely, his tie slightly loosened, as if he had been rushing all morning. I watched him carefully, searching for a flicker of guilt, some sign that he had heard his wife's words and disagreed. When the men left, I stepped closer. He saw me, but his expression froze, his lips pressed tight. I waited for him to say something, anything, but he kept quiet. The silence between us stretched like a rope pulled too tight. Finally, I asked in a low voice if he had heard Elena. He swallowed hard and looked at the floor. "Dad," he muttered, "it's New Year's Day. Let's not make a scene, not make a scene." My only son, the boy I carried on my shoulders through snowy Ohio winters, the boy I taught to ride a bike in the cracked driveway of our old red brick house, could not even find the courage to defend me. I felt the sting cut deeper than Elena's words. At least with her, the cruelty was open and deliberate. With him, it was the cowardice of silence. I turned away before my voice broke. In the kitchen, the caterers were unpacking trays, the scent of roast beef and garlic bread filling the air. I leaned against the counter, feeling out of place in my own home. One of the young servers glanced at me kindly, asked if I needed water. I thanked her and shook my head. Upstairs in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the silver ring into my palm. Harold had always been the strong one, steady and unshakable, while I was the dreamer. Yet here I was, old and alone, standing in a house built on my sacrifice, treated as if I were a shadow. I thought of her voice, the night before she died, telling me not to let anyone strip away my dignity. The sounds of the party drifted through the walls, muffled music, bursts of laughter. I pictured Elena holding court in the living room, her glass raised high as she welcomed everyone. I pictured David standing beside her, silent, complicit. The pain in my chest grew heavier until I had to stand and pace. I left the room and went downstairs again. Near the grand staircase, Elena was arranging flowers, her voice bright as she called to a friend about the band arriving soon. She turned, caught my eye, and for a second her smile slipped, revealing the sharpness underneath. Then it was back, warm and false. I wanted to speak, to confront her, but David was there close enough to hear. Instead, I walked out to the patio. The California sun was bright, almost too bright, and I shielded my eyes with my hand. Children of guests ran across the lawn, laughing, their sneakers flashing in the light. It should have been a moment of joy. But I felt like an outsider, peering through a glass wall. Margaret, Elena's mother, arrived then, elegant, in a cream dress. She kissed her daughter's cheek and gave me only the briefest nod. Her face carried the same polished mask Elena had perfected. I wondered if that was where Elena had learned it. The hours dragged on, each one tightening the knot inside my chest. When I tried to speak to David later that afternoon to ask if we could sit down privately, he brushed me off. Not today, Dad. We have too much going on. Maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow. Always tomorrow, never now. By the time dusk fell, the mansion glowed with string lights, the pool reflecting 1,000 little suns. Music swelled from the hired band, couples danced, champagne glasses clinked. I stood alone near the back fence, listening to the chatter of neighbors. I caught bits of conversation about the grandeur of the house, the luck of David and Elena, the picture-perfect life they had created. Not once did anyone mention me. To them, I was invisible. I thought of Cleveland again, of the snowy nights in our old home, of Harold's laugh echoing through the kitchen. She had worked double shifts at the hospital so David could go to college without debt. She had trusted me to protect what we built, and now our son let me stand outside my own family. The anger settled cold in my bones. I walked back inside, past the musicians, past the buffet, past Elena's satisfied smile. David met my eyes briefly, but said nothing. I went upstairs to my room, shut the door, and sat in the dark. For the first time, I admitted to myself that they would never stop seeing me as a burden. Not unless I made them. I looked at the documents I had tucked away, in the drawer copies of payment receipts, a ledger of the years I had shouldered the bills. Proof that my place here was not a favor, but a right. The sounds of fireworks began outside, popping and crackling, as the neighborhood welcomed the new year. I sat quietly, the papers spread across the bed. My hands no longer trembled. They had given me their gift. Soon I would return it. The house was silent the next morning, the kind of silence that follows a storm. Trays from the night before were still stacked in the kitchen. Half-empty glasses lined the counters, and the faint smell of smoke from fireworks lingered in the air. I moved quietly through the rooms, picking up stray napkins and plates, though it was not my responsibility anymore. Every step reminded me of Harold, of how she used to hum while cleaning after family gatherings. I pressed the ring on my finger and whispered to her that I had not forgotten what Elena said. David was sitting at the dining table with his laptop, sipping coffee. He looked worn out, his tie loose, his hair uncombed. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Then I remembered how he had chosen silence over me. I stood behind him, waiting for him to acknowledge me. When he finally did, he glanced up briefly and asked if I needed something. I asked if we could talk privately. He hesitated, then shut the laptop and leaned back. Dad, Elena was just upset yesterday. It was the holidays. She had too much champagne. She did not mean it. Not mean it, I repeated. Your wife told me to disappear, and you stood there with your hands in your pockets. He rubbed his forehead and sighed. You are overthinking this. We are starting a new year, and the last thing I need is conflict in this house. This house, I said slowly. Whose house do you think it is? His eyes flickered uneasy, but he stayed quiet. The silence told me everything. Later that afternoon, I went into the den and unlocked the old cabinet where I kept files. Years of mortgage payments, property tax receipts, utility bills, even insurance policies, all with my name, not theirs. I spread the papers across the desk, a quiet reminder that what I had built with Harold could not be erased with a cruel sentence. I did not notice Elena until her reflection appeared in the glass door behind me. She stepped inside, arms folded, her voice calm but cutting. What are you doing with those old papers? I told her they were mine, and I had every right to look at them. She smiled, not kindly, and said, maybe it was time I let go of old things and enjoy retirement. After all, she added, the house worked better with new hands managing it. My blood ran cold. I asked her what she meant. She tilted her head and said it was natural for generations to move forward, for the younger ones to take control. You can relax now, she said. We have it handled? Handled. As if I were an employee being dismissed. That evening, while they laughed with friends in the living room. I walked outside to the garage. I sat in the car, the leather still carrying the scent of the cleaner I had used last week. In the glove box, I kept a small black notebook pages filled with Harold's handwriting. She had kept records of every payment, every home repair, every sacrifice. I turned the pages slowly, my chest tight with both grief and resolve. The next day, I drove into town. The law office of Peterson and Gray sat on Main Street, its windows decorated with simple holiday wreaths. Mr. Gray had known me since the 70s. He shook my hand warmly, asked about David, asked about the house. I placed the folder of documents on his desk and told him everything. His brow furrowed as he read. After a long pause, he said, "Mr. Thompson, these records are strong. No one can deny you own that property. But if your daughter-in-law is trying to position herself with control, you need to be cautious. Do not confront her without a plan." I asked if she could claim rights just by living there. He shook his head. "Not if you have the deed and the records." "Still," he added, "I would advise updating your will and placing the house in a trust, something untouchable. That way no one can contest it later." I thanked him and left the weight in my chest lighter, but still heavy enough to press me down. When I returned, Elena was on the porch talking to a neighbor. She was laughing, her hand resting lightly on the rail, her voice full of charm. For a moment, I almost believed she was the gracious wife and mother everyone thought she was. Then her eyes met mine, and I saw it again, that flash of contempt. Inside, David was pacing with his phone pressed to his ear, whispering about work. When he hung up, I asked him directly if Elena had been speaking to anyone about the house. He stiffened. "Why would she?" "Because she speaks as if it is already hers," I said. He grew defensive, his voice rising. "Dad, you are making trouble out of nothing. Elena takes care of things because you cannot keep up anymore." My hands trembled, but not from weakness. I leaned closer and told him firmly that I had managed this house for 40 years without his wife's approval. His face reddened, but he said nothing. That night, I lay awake in my room, listening to their muffled voices down the hall. My name floated in and out of their whispers, mixed with the word stubborn and the word problem. I clenched the silver ring and made myself a promise. If they wanted me gone, they would learn what it meant to lose everything. The first step had already begun. The papers were ready, the lawyer prepared. Now all I needed was patience, and patience was something age had taught me well. The next morning, the sun cast long golden beams across the lawn. I stood by the window watching David load boxes into his car for work. Elena appeared behind him, carrying their baby, her expression soft and motherly for the world to see. But when she glanced up at me in the window, her smile vanished. The battle lines were drawn, even if no one else could see them yet. And I was ready. 2 days later, the mansion was filled again, this time with Elena's friends from her yoga studio and a few colleagues of David's. The music was softer, more polished, the wine more expensive. I sat near the back of the living room, pretending to read the paper, while really watching every move. Elena drifted between groups, like a hostess born into wealth, not someone who married into a family that sacrificed everything to give her husband a chance. One woman leaned close and whispered to her eyes, flicking toward me. Elena laughed lightly and said something I could not catch, but I saw the smirk. My stomach turned. I folded the paper and walked out onto the porch, the cold air sharper than I expected for a California January. The night sky was clear, and I stared up at it, asking Harold silently if I was being too stubborn. But deep inside, I knew I was not. When the last guests left, I waited in the hallway listening. Their voices carried from the kitchen, Elena's tone firm, David's softer, hesitant. She was telling him it was time to start planning ahead, that my room upstairs could be turned into a home office for him. He mumbled something about it being too soon. Her response cut like a blade. He is old, David. He cannot live here forever. I pushed open the door before I lost my nerve. Both of them froze when they saw me. I kept my voice calm but steady. I heard enough. This house is not yours to carve up like a pie. Elena straightened her chin high. With all respect, Henry, we are the ones running this household now. You should be enjoying peace, not clinging to old papers and memories. David tried to intervene, but I silenced him with a look. 40 years of mortgage payments are not old papers. The roof you sleep under, the walls around you, all built on those memories. Do not mistake kindness for surrender. Elena's face flushed red, but she did not back down. You cannot stop the future. Families evolve. Control passes. My voice hardened. Families evolve with respect. Without it, they fall apart. I turned and left them standing in the kitchen, their whispers following me like gnats. In my room, I sat at the desk and opened the folder again, my hand steady now. I began drafting a letter to Mr. Gray, asking him to move forward with the trust immediately. As I wrote, I realized something else. If Elena was bold enough to say these things aloud, she might be taking steps behind the scenes already. The next morning, I went through the mail more carefully. Most envelopes were addressed to David or Elena. Utilities, subscription services, even bank statements, all redirected under their names. My pulse quickened. They were building a case stone by stone to edge me out of my own home. I took photographs of everything, each envelope laid out neatly on my desk, evidence plain and undeniable. When Elena passed my door and noticed what I was doing, she paused. For a moment, her polished mask slipped, and I saw irritation, even fear. But she quickly smiled and said, "You should let us handle the paperwork. It is too much for you." I answered without looking up, "That will never happen." That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed every slight, every dismissive word, every cold look. I thought about Harold again, how she would have fought with her whole heart for the dignity of this home. By dawn, I had made another decision. Not only would I secure the trust, but I would make sure Elena and David understood exactly what they had gambled with. At breakfast, I set the stack of envelopes on the table. David looked at them confused. Elena reached for them quickly, but I held them back. I said, "These are not mistakes. These are moves. Quiet moves meant to erase me." David's voice cracked. "Dad, that is not true." I slammed my palm on the table, the sound startling even me. "Do not lie to yourself, David. She has been planning this for months, and you let her." Elena tried to laugh, brushing it off as paranoia, but I saw her knuckles tighten around her coffee mug. David looked between us, torn, his shoulders sagging under the weight. For a moment, I almost hoped he would defend me, but he only whispered that we should all calm down. I left the table without another word and locked my room. I knew now that this battle would not be won with pleas or patience. It would be won with proof and with resolve. Later in the evening, as fireworks from another neighborhood celebration echoed faintly in the distance, I sat by the window and watched the mansion glow with light. From the outside, it looked perfect, a picture of wealth and harmony. Inside, it was rotting, poisoned by greed and silence. I pressed Harold's ring to my lips and whispered that I would not fail her. If they wanted me gone, they would soon learn what disappearing really meant. The morning sun spilled through the blinds as I packed a small duffel bag, folding shirts with deliberate care. Each movement steadied me. I slipped the folder of documents into the side pocket, the proof of everything Harold and I had built. I did not leave a note, not yet. Let them wonder. Downstairs, Elena's voice carried from the kitchen, sharp and commanding as she gave instructions to the housekeeper. I walked past without a word. She glanced at me, her eyes narrowing, but I kept moving toward the front door. For a brief moment I thought David might stop me, but he stayed seated at the table, his fork poised above his plate, frozen in hesitation. The air outside was cool and fresh. I loaded the bag into the trunk of my old Buick, the same car that had carried Harold and me on road trips across the Midwest. As I pulled out of the driveway, I did not look back. My first stop was the bank on Maple Avenue. I met with Mr. Jenkins, a manager who had known me for decades. He greeted me warmly, though his expression grew serious when I explained I needed to review all joint accounts transfers, anything unusual. We went through records carefully, and sure enough, recent withdrawals had been made under David's signature. Large ones. When I asked about them, Mr. Jenkins said David had presented himself as co-manager of household funds. He assumed I had given permission. My jaw tightened, but I thanked him and requested copies of every statement. I left with a thick envelope under my arm, the evidence burning against my side. Next, I drove to the courthouse in downtown Riverside. The clerk's office smelled faintly of paper and dust. I asked to search property filings for my address. The woman behind the counter raised an eyebrow but handed me a stack of documents. My pulse quickened as I flipped through them. Among the routine tax assessments was a recent inquiry filed under Elena's name about transfer of deed information. My stomach churned. She was not just thinking about it, she was preparing. I copied everything paying in cash and walked back out into the crisp air. The city bustled around me, but all I felt was cold clarity. By evening, I had checked into a modest motel on the edge of town, a place Harold and I had once stayed when our house was being renovated. The carpet was worn, the lamps a little crooked, but the quiet wrapped around me like a shield. I placed the documents on the bed and arranged them carefully. Bank records, property inquiries, utility bills in Elena's name, all of it forming a pattern that could no longer be denied. I stared at the stack for a long while, then pulled out Harold's old notebook. Her neat handwriting filled the pages, each line a record of sacrifice of love turned into numbers. I traced her words with my finger, remembering the sound of her laughter in the kitchen, the warmth of her hand on mine. She would not have let them walk over us. The phone on the nightstand rang. I let it buzz 3 times before answering. It was David. His voice cracked as he asked where I was. I told him simply that I needed space. He started to protest to explain, but I cut him off. I know about the accounts, the inquiries at the courthouse, the bills. Silence followed. Then he whispered that it was Elena's idea, that he had gone along because he felt trapped. I told him I had proof and that soon others would see it too. He begged me not to ruin his family. I almost laughed. His family, not mine. I hung up before anger swallowed me whole. The night stretched on each tick of the clock, sharpening my resolve. I opened my notebook and began writing a detailed account line by line of everything I had witnessed. My memory was clear, my pen steady. If the time came, no one would doubt my story. The next morning, I returned to Mr. Gray's office. He looked through the pile of evidence, and his face grew stern. "Henry, this is serious. If they continue, it could turn into attempted fraud. We can act now, set up the trust immediately, and file a notice with the county. That way, no matter what paperwork they try to push, it will be blocked." I nodded. "Do it." As I left the office, I felt lighter. The steps were in motion. But another thought pressed into my mind. If Elena was bold enough to try legal maneuvers, she might not stop at paperwork. She might push David further, use the child as leverage, twist every knife she could. I drove back toward the mansion, parking on the street instead of pulling into the driveway. From the car, I watched through the wide windows. Elena was inside with the baby cooing sweetly, her mask perfect for anyone who did not know better. David sat slumped on the couch, shoulders hunched. I stayed there until the sun dipped low and the lights inside flickered on. Then I turned the key and drove back to the motel. For now, my absence was my weapon. Let them feel what life was like without me. Let them realize the silence of my chair at the table, the empty space in the house that was never theirs. In the stillness of that small room, I folded the documents back into their envelope and placed it under the pillow. The sound of traffic outside faded, replaced by my own steady breathing. The game had changed. I was no longer the quiet old man in the corner of their house. I was the storm they never saw coming. I woke early long before the sun had risen and sat at the small desk in the motel room with a pot of weak coffee. The stack of papers lay spread out in front of me, and I read through them again slower this time, careful to mark each detail with a yellow pen I had bought at the gas station. The more I studied, the clearer the pattern became. Elena wasn't simply trying to edge me out of their lives. She was orchestrating a full takeover bit by bit, making sure that when I was gone, nothing of mine would remain. The motel's thin curtains glowed faintly as the sky turned pale. I packed the evidence into a neat folder and slipped it into my duffel bag. Today would not be about hiding. Today was about setting traps of my own. By mid-morning, I was at the county recorder's office again. I handed the clerk the documents Mr. Gray had prepared and requested that a notice of my interest in the property be filed immediately. The young woman behind the counter tapped at her keyboard, then looked up with a polite smile and said it was done. Just like that, any attempt to sell, refinance, or transfer the house would hit a wall. I walked out feeling taller than I had in years. For too long, Elena had painted me as an old man who could be pushed aside. Now the law itself stood between her and my erasure. Later that afternoon, I made a stop at Riverside Savings. Mr. Jenkins welcomed me into his office again. I asked him to freeze any joint account activity until further notice. He frowned, reminding me that David was listed as an authorized user. I shook my head. That authority ends now. He hesitated, then nodded, promising to flag any transaction for my direct approval. Another wall erected. As the sun dipped low, I parked near the mansion again. Lights glowed in the windows, and through the sheer curtains, I could see movement. Elena moved from room to room in a bright red sweater, her voice carrying even through the glass, when she called for David. He appeared sluggish, his shoulders slouched. Their laughter sounded forced brittle like glass ready to shatter. I sat in the car with the engine off, watching. It wasn't malice that kept me there. It was confirmation. Without my steady hand, without my quiet sacrifices, the cracks in their life were already showing. That night in the motel, I received a call. The number belonged to Margaret Howard, Elena's mother. I hesitated before answering. Her tone was calm, measured. She told me she had heard from Elena, who was hysterical, claiming I was trying to destroy their lives. Margaret surprised me. Instead of scolding, she said quietly that Elena had been spoiled from the start, that her father had shielded her from every consequence. She confessed she was tired of bailing her daughter out. We spoke for nearly half an hour. She admitted she had always wondered how long I would tolerate Elena's ways. When I told her about the accounts and the house filings, she didn't deny them. She simply sighed. Maybe this is what she needs, she said. To finally face a wall she can't climb over. Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. For years I had carried the guilt of enabling David and Elena, convincing myself that sacrifice was love. Now for the first time, someone else, her own mother, saw the same truth. The next morning I drove to a small diner on Pine Street. Mr. Gray met me there with a fresh set of documents. He had drafted a trust in my name, ensuring that if anything happened to me, my portion of the house and my remaining savings would bypass David and Elena entirely, going directly to charities I had chosen. He slid the papers across the table, his coffee steaming between us, and I signed without hesitation. It was one thing to protect myself in life. It was another to make sure my disappearance, should it ever come, would never be used as their victory. By evening, the phone calls from David grew frantic. I ignored most of them, though one voicemail played in my ear as I sat in the dim motel room. His voice cracked, begging me to come back, promising that Elena hadn't meant what she said on New Year's Day. He said the house felt empty without me, that their plans were falling apart. I didn't delete the message. I let it sit there, a reminder of the reversal already taking place. The following day, I visited Sunset Gardens Country Club. The receptionist greeted me warmly, recognizing my name on the ledger. I asked about the upcoming New Year's reception David and Elena had scheduled. She confirmed it was under my contract, my deposit, my signature. I nodded, then requested cancellation. She blinked confused, but when I insisted, she made the calls, scratched their names off the guest list, and promised refunds would be processed. Walking out into the bright winter air, I felt a rush of something sharp and clean. They had wanted me gone. Now their celebration, their showpiece of status, was gone with me. Back at the motel that night, I boiled water for tea in the small electric kettle. I pulled out my old chipped mug, the one Harold had given me decades ago, and poured slowly. The crack along its side had deepened, but it still held. I cupped it in both hands, breathing in the steam, and thought of Harold's voice. Never let them treat you small. The phone rattled again on the nightstand, Elena's name flashing across the screen. I let it ring. A second later, it buzzed again. I answered this time. Her voice was shrill, frantic. She accused me of humiliating her, of ruining their reputation. She screamed about the canceled reception, about what people would say. When she paused for breath, I spoke evenly. No, Elena. What I canceled was an illusion. If you want a wedding, you can still have one. But you will not have it on my back. Her gasp cut through the line. She shouted that I was vindictive, cruel, jealous. I told her simply that I was done funding her fantasies. The line went silent for a long beat before she hung up. I set the phone down and sipped my tea, letting the bitterness ground me. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. I wasn't waiting to be remembered. I had chosen the storm, and it was already shaking their walls. The motel room felt quiet, almost peaceful. Outside, headlights swept across the parking lot. Inside, the papers, the contracts, the recordings of calls, all of it sat in a neat stack beside me. I leaned back in the chair, the chipped cup warm in my hands, and let the silence stretch. This was only the beginning. The morning light crept through the thin motel curtains, and I sat at the small table with a notebook writing down every move I had made so far. It wasn't paranoia. It was protection. I knew Elena would twist the story, and I needed a record that showed exactly what I had done and why. Dates, phone calls, receipts, filings, all of it went into neat columns in my careful handwriting. Years of nursing had taught me the value of documenting everything. By late morning, the phone buzzed again. This time it was David. I almost ignored it, but something in me wanted to hear his voice. When I answered, there was no anger, just a tired heaviness. He said Elena had locked herself in their bedroom since last night, crying and pacing, accusing me of trying to destroy their lives. His voice cracked when he asked why I hated them so much. I didn't raise my voice. I told him plainly I didn't hate him, but I was done allowing myself to be erased. There was a pause, and I could hear the sound of him rubbing his forehead the way he used to as a boy when he couldn't figure out his homework. He begged me to meet in person, to talk it through. I said, not today, not on his schedule, not when my life had already been decided for me, without consent. I hung up before his silence could pull me back into old habits. That afternoon, I drove into town to meet with Mr. Gray again. His office smelled faintly of lemon polish and coffee, and his desk was stacked with files. He listened as I explained the voicemail from Elena, the accusations, the panic. He leaned back, nodding slowly, then told me to expect escalation. People like her, he said, rarely stop at words. They push until they find resistance. He reminded me that the law was on my side, but only if I was ready to stand firm when the storm grew louder. I told him I was more ready now than I had ever been. When I returned to the motel, the manager was waiting by the front desk. She handed me an envelope that had been dropped off by courier. Inside was a formal letter from David and Elena drafted by their attorney, demanding that I vacate any claim on the house, threatening to pursue a competency review if I refused. My hands shook not with fear, but with the sharpness of betrayal. My own son was willing to drag me into court to prove I was no longer of sound mind. I took the elevator up to my room and laid the letter flat on the desk beside my ledger. The weight of it pressed heavy against my chest, but beneath that heaviness was something harder, steadier. If they wanted war, they would find I had already drawn the map. That night, as I sat with my chipped cup of tea, I remembered Harold's voice in the old voicemail I kept saved. I played it once more, his rasp steady and warm, reminding me never to let them treat me small. It steadied me, gave me back the courage the letter had tried to steal. The next day, I walked into the county courthouse with my folder clutched under my arm. The investigator who greeted me was young, maybe not even 40, but his expression was professional and kind. He asked if I understood why I was there. I told him clearly my son and his wife believed setting boundaries meant I had lost my mind. Then I opened the ledger and laid it out in front of him. Page after page of payments I had covered: utilities, insurance, HOA fees, credit cards. Each number dated each entry in my neat script. He listened carefully, taking notes, nodding as he examined the records. He asked about my daily routines, how I managed my finances, my medications, my schedule. I answered each question steadily, telling him about the community book club I attended, the walking trail I planned to join, the bills I paid myself. At one point, I pulled out my phone and played Harold's voicemail. The investigator listened, then looked at me with an expression I hadn't expected. Respect. When the review ended, he closed his folder and said softly, "You are more than competent, Mr. Walker. You are careful. That is a strength." I thanked him, my throat tight, and walked out of that courthouse taller than when I had entered. By the time I returned to the motel, the winter sun was dipping low, painting the parking lot in long gray lines. My phone buzzed with messages, each one from David, each one a plea to stop, to think of family, to forgive Elena. I didn't answer. Instead, I brewed another pot of tea, opened my ledger, and wrote down one simple sentence beside the day's date. I am not small. That night, sleep came slower. The walls of the motel hummed with the noise of passing cars, the air faint with the smell of bleach. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling both the ache of my son's betrayal and the steel of my own resolve. They had chosen to turn this into a battle. Fine. I had chosen to fight with truth, with records, with the law. Sometime after midnight, the phone rattled again. This time it was Margaret. She said she had spoken to Elena, who was demanding she cover the buyout, insisting her mother owed her that much. Margaret's voice hardened as she told me she had refused. She said she was done enabling, done rescuing. For the first time, I heard in her voice the same boundary I had finally drawn. We spoke in quiet tones, two older parents finally admitting our part in raising children who believed the world owed them comfort. Margaret's final words stayed with me long after we hung up. Sometimes love is the refusal to interfere. I set the phone down, slid Harold's ring along my finger, and whispered into the quiet of the room, "Let them swim." The motel hummed steady around me, and outside the parking lot, lights glowed against the dark. Tomorrow would bring another fight, another attempt to corner me. But tonight, I felt the strength of knowing that my silence had finally been replaced with resolve. The next morning, I drove straight to Mr. Gray's office, the courthouse letter still heavy in my folder. He looked up from his desk when I entered, his brow furrowed as if he already knew what had arrived. I slid the papers across the polished wood, and he read in silence. When he finally spoke, his tone was steady. "They are bluffing, Harold, but they will push until they see you won't bend." We spent the next hour preparing a counter. He explained the steps, the filings, the statements I would need. Each word felt like armor being fitted piece by piece. By the time I left, the sun was high, but the weight on my chest had eased. Instead of returning to the motel, I drove to the house. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the mansion came into view. Elena's SUV was parked in the driveway, spotless as always, and David's truck sat crooked at the curb. I sat in my car for a long minute watching. When I finally stepped out, the winter air bit cold against my face. I walked up the stone steps and rang the bell. David opened the door, surprise flickering across his face. He looked tired, older than his years, with shadows under his eyes. Behind him I could hear Elena's voice, sharp and rising. "Dad," he said, his voice low. "What are you doing here?" I stepped inside without asking. Elena appeared in the hallway, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She demanded to know why I was harassing them, why I couldn't let them live their lives. I told her plainly that the house still carried my name, my money, my sacrifices. She laughed a brittle sound and said, "Money didn't make me family." David stood between us, his hands raised like a man trying to hold back a fire. He begged us both to stop, his words tumbling over each other, but neither of us listened. Elena's voice grew sharper, accusing me of ruining their wedding, their reputation, their future. She said no one respected a man who clung to the past. I felt something shift inside me. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I simply said, "You asked me to disappear. I am doing exactly that, and when I am gone, you will see what else disappears with me." Her smile faltered for the first time, just a flicker, but I saw it. David turned toward me, his voice breaking. "Dad, please, can we fix this?" I shook my head. "You had your chance. You stood silent when she asked me to vanish." I left before either of them could answer. The door closed behind me with a heavy thud, and I walked back to my car feeling the cold air sting my lungs. That evening, I met Margaret at a small cafe on Main Street. She was already seated at a corner table, her coat draped neatly over the chair. She looked tired, but her eyes held a clarity I hadn't seen before. She told me Elena had called her again, screaming, demanding money, demanding rescue. Margaret had refused once more. We sat together for an hour, two older parents bound by disappointment and reluctant hope. She admitted she had enabled Elena for too long, always smoothing the edges, always paying the bills. She said maybe this time consequences would teach what comfort never could. Her honesty steadied me. It reminded me I wasn't alone in this fight. When I returned to the motel, I found another letter slipped under my door. This one wasn't from an attorney. It was from David. His handwriting was shaky, the words uneven. He wrote that he felt trapped between me and Elena, that he wished Harold were still alive to guide him. He asked if I could remember the boy he once was, not the man he had become. I sat on the bed reading those lines over and over. For a moment my chest ached with something dangerously close to forgiveness. But then I remembered his silence on New Year's Day, the way his eyes had slid away as though I had already disappeared. That memory hardened me again. I folded the letter and placed it in my folder with the rest of the documents. Proof of his weakness, not my duty to heal it. Outside the motel parking lot buzzed with life headlights sweeping past as families returned from late dinners. Inside, the room was still. I poured a cup of tea, the steam rising into the dim light, and pressed Harold's ring against my palm. Tomorrow would bring the next move. Tonight I let the silence steady me once more. The following morning, I stood outside the courthouse, again folder in hand, the winter air sharp against my face. Inside, the hallways hummed with quiet voices and the echo of footsteps on marble floors. My stomach tightened, but my steps were steady. I had lived through worse storms than this. The investigator greeted me with the same calm expression as before. He asked a few more questions, then reviewed the new letter David and Elena's attorney had sent. He scanned my ledger again, each page lined with my careful handwriting. When he looked up, there was no doubt in his eyes. "Mr. Walker, you are capable. These accusations will not stand." Relief warmed my chest, but it was brief. Outside the courtroom doors, David was waiting. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loose as though he had dressed in a rush. His face softened when he saw me, but his eyes carried a weight I hadn't seen since he was a boy. "Dad, can we talk, just for a minute?" I hesitated, then nodded. We stepped out into the cold, the sound of traffic carrying through the streets. He shoved his hands into his pockets, his shoulders slumped. "Elena is unraveling," he admitted. "She hardly sleeps. She keeps saying you're out to destroy her." He looked at me as if begging me to deny it. I told him the truth. I wasn't out to destroy her. I was done being erased. His mouth opened as though to argue, but no words came. He stared at the sidewalk, then whispered that the bills were piling up. They had missed the HOA payment, and the bank had sent a warning about their credit cards. He rubbed his forehead, the same nervous habit from childhood. I reminded him quietly that those bills used to land on my desk, that I'd paid them without question. His silence was my answer. He wanted rescue, but he could not say the words. I let the moment stretch, then told him I would not save them again. His eyes filled with something close to shame, and for a heartbeat, I almost reached for him. But then, I remembered New Year's Day, the words Elena had spoken with a smile, and I held my ground. Back at the motel that evening, I spread my papers across the desk. The ledger told a story David could not deny. Every number was a reminder of my presence, every canceled check a measure of my sacrifice. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the bitterness keep me awake. Near midnight, the phone rang again. Elena's voice burst through the line before I could even say hello. She accused me of plotting, of turning David against her, of ruining their lives, piece by piece. Her words poured out like venom, but I let her talk. When she paused, I said evenly, "No, Elena, I'm simply teaching you that actions have consequences." Her scream was sharp enough to make me hold the phone away from my ear. "You're cruel," she cried. "You've ruined everything." Then the line went dead. I sat in the silence, my hand trembling slightly, and reached for Harold's ring. Its weight steadied me. I was not cruel. I was careful. The next day, Margaret called. Her tone was calm, almost weary. She told me Elena had demanded again that she pay the buyout, but Margaret had refused. She said she was finished rescuing, finished smoothing over her daughter's mistakes. She told me something that stayed with me long after we hung up. "Elena doesn't fear losing you, Harold. She fears the day her choices finally matter." Her words rang true. Elena had never faced the weight of consequence. She had always had someone to pick up the pieces. Now, for the first time, the pieces were hers to hold. That night, I walked to the small diner down the street for supper. The waitress poured me coffee and set a plate of stew in front of me. Around me, families laughed, couples spoke in quiet tones. For a moment, I let myself simply be another man at a table, not a father in a battle. The food was warm, the coffee bitter, the hum of voices steady. When I returned to the motel, a letter waited at the front desk. This one was handwritten by David. His words were softer this time. He wrote that he didn't know how to balance being a husband and a son, that he felt like he was drowning. He asked if I remembered teaching him to swim at Miller's Lake. how I told him to kick harder when the water felt heavy. He asked if I could give him one more lesson now. I carried the letter upstairs, unfolded it on the desk, and read it twice. My chest ached with memory, with the echo of his small hand gripping mine in the lake years ago. For a moment I wanted to rush to him to save him. But then I looked at the ledger, at the proof of every sacrifice, every quiet erasure. I folded the letter carefully and slid it under the ledger. Some lessons couldn't be taught by rescue. Some had to be learned by struggle. Outside, the night was quiet. Inside, the chipped cup sat warm in my hands. I whispered to Harold's ring that I had chosen my line, and I would not bend. The silence of the room answered back steady as a heartbeat. The next morning, the phone woke me before the sun had climbed high. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered anyway. A voice introduced herself as a clerk from the bank. She said a large withdrawal attempt had been flagged from one of the joint accounts. My stomach tightened. I asked her if the withdrawal had gone through. She said no. The freeze I had placed with Mr. Jenkins had stopped it. She apologized for the inconvenience, but I thanked her. It was not an inconvenience. It was proof that my walls were holding. I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the thin carpet. Elena was panicking. She was testing every door to see which one would open. I would not be that door. Later that morning, I walked into Gray's office again, the same folder under my arm. He was waiting with fresh documents. He explained that Elena and David's attorney had filed another petition pushing for a forced sale of the house unless I accepted a settlement. I scanned the papers, my jaw tightening. They wanted me cornered, rushed, afraid. Instead, I felt steadier. We drafted our own filing, a counterclaim that laid out every payment I had made, every deposit, every receipt supported by my ledger. Gray slid the papers into a neat stack and looked me in the eye. They may come at you with noise, but we have proof. Courts respect proof. That afternoon, I drove past the mansion. The lawn looked unkempt, small weeds pushing through the cracks in the driveway. Their SUV was gone, but David's truck sat outside, its hood dented. I parked down the street and watched for a few minutes. The house that had once glowed with lights looked dim, tired. Curtains drawn, no music, no laughter. My chest felt both heavy and relieved. Their show was crumbling without me. That night at the motel, I received a text from Margaret. She wrote that Elena had demanded again that she cover their debts. Margaret told her no firmly this time, and Elena had screamed at her before slamming the phone down. Margaret ended her message with a short line. She is finally meeting the mirror. I read the words 3 times, then set the phone aside. The following day, I walked into the courthouse again, this time for a preliminary hearing. The courtroom was nearly empty, the air dry and cool. I sat at one table with Gray while David and Elena sat across from me with their attorney. David's eyes wouldn't meet mine. Elena looked at me with a stare so sharp it could have cut glass. The judge listened to both sides. Their attorney painted me as a bitter old man, clinging to power, incapable of letting go. Gray countered with the ledger, with receipts, with contracts bearing my name. When the judge asked me to speak, I stood slowly, the weight of Harold's ring steadying me. I told the court that I had sold my house to help my son start his life, that I had poured nearly all my savings into the villa, with the promise that I would always have a place there. I explained that I had paid their bills when they could not, that I had been erased from photographs in a house my hands had built. My voice did not shake. I ended simply by saying I was not trying to destroy my family. I was trying to keep from being destroyed by them. The room was silent when I sat down. The judge said she would review the filings and issue a decision in due time. For now, nothing would change. That nothing was enough for me. Outside the courthouse, David followed me to the steps. He spoke quietly away from Elena, who lingered by the car with her arms crossed. "Dad, please," he said, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "We can't breathe anymore." I looked at him, at the boy I once carried on my shoulders at the county fair. I told him softly that he had chosen silence when I needed his voice most. His lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. He lowered his gaze and walked back to Elena. Back at the motel, I brewed tea in the chipped cup. The steam rose and curled into the dim light, and I whispered to Harold's memory that I had not faltered. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing fully upright. That night, another knock came at my door. I opened it to find Margaret. She stepped into the small room with a scarf wrapped tight around her neck. She looked at the stack of papers on the desk, the half-empty cup of tea, the single bed. Her eyes softened. She said she admired my strength, that maybe together we had both given our children too much. We talked for hours. She admitted she had feared Elena's breakdown, that she worried her daughter would destroy everything around her rather than face consequence. I told her I feared the same, but I was done cushioning the fall. When she finally left, the night was deep and still. I sat alone listening to the hum of the heater, the ring cool against my finger. I thought of the courtroom, of David's tired eyes, of Elena's brittle stare. The battle wasn't over. It was only shifting into its next stage. I turned out the light, lay back on the thin mattress, and let the quiet wrap around me. The walls of the motel felt stronger than the mansion ever had. Here in this plain little room, I belonged to myself. The morning after the hearing, I drove out toward Miller's Lake, the place where I'd taught David to swim when he was 8 years old. The water was low winter, pulling it back from the rocks, but the sight of it still carried the weight of memory. I sat on a bench near the shore, the cold wind tugging at my coat, and thought about the boy who once trusted me with every kick and breath. Somewhere between then and now, that trust had drowned. On my way back, I stopped at the diner on Pine Street. The waitress poured my coffee without asking, smiling the way she always did, and I opened the newspaper someone had left behind. Buried in the financial section was a small article about a local developer filing bankruptcy. The name caught my eye. It was the same developer who had hosted parties at the mansion last summer, the same man Elena bragged about knowing. My chest tightened with realization. If they had tied themselves to him, even socially, the fall would be public. That afternoon, Margaret called. Her voice was clipped, hurried. She told me Elena had been calling her again, demanding she take out a loan to cover their expenses. Margaret had said no, but she could hear panic in her daughter's voice, the kind of desperation that comes when walls close in. She asked if I was safe, if I felt threatened. I assured her I was fine, though inside I knew this was the moment when desperation could turn reckless. I decided not to hide anymore. That evening I drove back to the mansion. The porch light flickered weakly as I walked up the steps. I rang the bell and waited. David opened the door, his face gaunt, his shirt wrinkled. Behind him I saw Elena pacing the living room, her phone clutched in her hand. She froze when she saw me. Her eyes narrowed and she hissed that I had no right to be there. I stepped inside anyway. David didn't stop me. I walked into the living room and set my folder on the coffee table. The sound of it hitting the wood cut through the silence. "These are records," I said calmly. "Proof of everything I paid, everything I carried. You think I am weak, that I can be erased? But every number here says otherwise." Elena's face flushed red. She accused me of fabricating, of inventing ways to shame her. I didn't argue. I simply opened the ledger to the page with their mortgage payment from 4 years ago, my check number clearly written. I laid down another, then another, each page, a nail in the coffin of her denial. David sat down heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. Elena's voice cracked as she shouted that money didn't matter, that this was about control. She called me selfish, bitter, cruel. I let her rage until the words burned out of her throat. When silence fell, I leaned forward, my voice steady. You told me the best gift was if I disappeared. Well, I disappeared. And look at what's happened since. Your parties canceled your accounts, frozen your reputation slipping. You wanted me gone, and now you see what goes with me. David looked up, his eyes wet. He whispered that he was sorry that he hadn't known it would come to this. Elena spun toward him furious, but his shoulders sagged. For the first time, I saw him hesitate in her shadow. I gathered my papers, slid them back into the folder, and stood. I told them both that the next move was theirs. I had no more to prove. I left the house with the weight of their silence pressing against my back. Back at the motel, I sat with Harold's ring pressed against my palm. The chipped cup steamed on the nightstand. The heater rattled softly, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the tremor of victory. Not triumph, not gloating, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth had finally spoken louder than silence. I turned out the light and let the darkness settle. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight I had peace enough to close my eyes. The sun was already high when I woke the hum of the heater fading into quiet. For the first time in weeks, I had slept without dreams of shouting voices or slamming doors. I brewed coffee in the little machine by the window and sipped it slowly, watching the cars glide down Main Street. The world outside carried on, and for once I felt no urgency to chase it. By noon, Mr. Gray called with news. The judge had reviewed all filings and issued a temporary order affirming my ownership and blocking any transfer until a full hearing could be scheduled. His voice was calm but edged with satisfaction. He said it was rare to see such clean documentation in cases like mine and that the court respected precision. I thanked him and hung up the weight of months of anxiety lifting from my shoulders. I decided to drive past the mansion one last time. The lawn was browning, the porch light still flickering weakly. Elena's SUV was gone, but David's truck sat crooked at the curb. I parked down the street and watched as he stepped out onto the porch. His posture bent, his gaze fixed on the ground. For a moment, I thought he might see me, but he turned back inside without looking up. I did not knock. I did not call out. Instead, I whispered a goodbye to the home I had built with Harold's hands and my own. The walls might stand, but the spirit we had poured into them was gone. I drove back to the motel, packed my things neatly, and checked out. The clerk handed me my receipt with a polite smile, unaware that the plain little room had been a fortress, a sanctuary that reminded me of who I was. That evening, I met Margaret again at the cafe on Main. She sat with her scarf tucked close, her tea steaming gently. She told me Elena had finally broken down, that her voice was raw from screaming, that she was blaming everyone but herself. Margaret's eyes softened as she said she was finished rescuing. I nodded, feeling the quiet bond between us two parents who had carried too much and finally learned to put the weight down. When I returned to my apartment, the space felt warm and honest. Modest furniture shelves lined with Harold's favorite books, a photograph of us at Miller's Lake smiling in the sunlight. I placed my folder of documents in the desk drawer, locked it, and left the key in the bowl by the door. I had no fear of erasure anymore. That night I brewed tea in the chipped cup and sat by the window watching the glow of street lamps flicker on, one by one. I pressed Harold's ring against my palm and whispered that I had kept my promise. I had not let them treat me small. I had disappeared on my own terms, and in that disappearance I found myself again. For the first time I felt no anger, only clarity. They had asked me to vanish, and in doing so, they lost the shield that had kept them steady. I was not the one ruined. I was the one who endured. As I set the cup down, I realized something else. Revenge had not been about destroying them. It had been about reclaiming me. If you have ever stood where I stood, silenced in your own home. I hope my story reminds you that your voice matters, that your proof matters, and that you are never too old to draw the line. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if you have faced something similar. And remember to stay with this channel for more stories like mine. Your support keeps these truths alive.